The letter fell from Alex Whitmore's hand. Land fraud. Forged deeds. Every ranch in this valley mine within the year. His jaw tightened. His fist closed around empty air where the paper had been. Because the man who sent it wasn't threatening his cattle or his land. He was threatening Clara. The widow who walked 10 miles with nothing but a suitcase. The woman who taught a broken man how to feel again. And now someone wanted to bury her past to steal his future. Before we go further, if stories like this touch something in you, hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end. And I'd love to know, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Montana Territory, summer of 1887. There wasn't a soul in Silver Creek who didn't know the name Alexander Whitmore. Not because he was kind, not because he was warm, but because he was rich and lonely, and everyone loves to talk about a man who has everything except the one thing that matters. His ranch stretched further than any man could ride in a single morning. His cattle were fat and healthy, his fences were straight, his barns never leaked. Men who worked for other ranchers in the valley would trade a week's wages just to say they'd once worked a season for Whitmore land. But none of them stayed long in the main house, because the main house didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum nobody wanted to visit. 5 years earlier, Alex had a wife. Her name was Margaret, and she used to fill that house with a kind of noise that made a man forget how big and empty a place could be without it. She sang while she cooked. She argued with him about the color of the curtains. She laughed too loud at his jokes, even the bad ones, especially the bad ones. Then a fever took her in 11 days. 11 days and the house went silent. Alex didn't cry in front of anyone. Ranchers didn't do that. He buried her on a hill overlooking the north pasture, said the words the preacher told him to say, and went back to work the next morning like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something in him had closed up like a door with no handle. The kitchen stove went cold most nights. The dining table, built to seat 12, held one chair pulled out, and the rest pushed in, untouched gathering dust like tombstones. The ranch hands ate simple food, beans, bread, whatever the cook, before Clara could throw together, because their employer had stopped noticing whether food tasted like anything at all. You'd think a man with his money could hire a proper cook. The foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Samuel Reed, muttered more than once to anyone who'd listen. But he don't care. Ain't cared about much since Mrs. Whitmore passed. Maybe he don't want to care, said old Pete, the stable hand, packing his pipe. Man loses a woman like that, some part of him just decides caring ain't worth the trouble no more. That was the trouble with Alex Whitmore. He'd decided somewhere in those 11 days that never hurting again was more important than ever feeling anything again. And for 5 years, that decision had worked exactly the way he wanted it to. He didn't hurt. He also didn't live. One morning in early June, Alex stood in his study staring at a blank sheet of paper for longer than he'd admit to anyone. The house had started to smell like dust and cold ash. Even he, a man who prided himself on needing nothing, was beginning to feel the weight of an empty house pressing down on his chest, like a stone he couldn't set down. He picked up his pen and wrote 11 words. Cook wanted. Good wages. Hard worker preferred. No unnecessary questions. He read it twice. Crossed out nothing. Rode into town himself and pinned it to the board outside the general store, ignoring the way Mrs. Caldwell, the storekeeper's wife, peered at him like he'd grown a second head just by speaking more than 3 sentences in a row. You writing your own advertisements now, Mr. Whitmore? She asked, arms crossed, eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that fed every conversation in a town too small for its own good. Thought a man like you had people for that. I do, Alex said, tipping his hat. I'm one of them. He rode home expecting nothing interesting. An older widow, maybe? A woman past marrying age looking for steady work and nothing more. Someone who would keep to herself, cook 3 meals, and leave him alone with his silence. That was what he expected. That was not what he got. 10 miles away on a dirt road cutting through wheat fields gone gold in the early summer sun, a woman named Clara Bennett walked with a suitcase in one hand and every ounce of pride she had left in the other. She was 32 years old, though the last 3 years had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with numbers. Her dress, once a deep forest green, had faded to something closer to gray. Her shoes had worn thin at the soles, and every mile she'd walked that morning had reminded her of it. Her hands that once played piano in her mother's parlor, back in Ohio, were calloused, now cracked at the knuckles. The hands of a woman who'd learned to survive with them instead of decorate a room with them. 3 years ago, Clara had been married to a man named Thomas Bennett. A good man, she'd believed. A hard-working man who dreamed too big and trusted the wrong people. When his business partner vanished with their savings and left behind a mountain of debt with Thomas's signature on it, the town of Millbrook had turned on both of them like a pack of dogs smelling blood. Thomas died 8 months later. The doctor called it his heart. Clara always believed it was shame that killed him. Shame he carried for trusting a man who'd made him look like a thief in front of everyone they'd ever known. She'd spent the 2 years since burying herself in whatever work she could find. Laundering other women's clothes, scrubbing other women's floors, watching other women's children while their husbands built lives Clara used to believe she'd have. When she heard about a cook's position on a wealthy rancher's land 10 miles outside Silver Creek, she didn't think twice. She packed the one suitcase she owned and started walking before the sun was fully up. Her feet ached by the 4th mile. Her legs burned by the 7th. By the 10th, when the Whitmore Ranch finally came into view, a house so large it looked like it belonged to 3 families instead of one lonely man. Clara Bennett stopped at the edge of the drive and allowed herself exactly one breath of doubt. What if he takes one look at you and sends you back the way you came? She straightened her spine. Then I'll walk back. I've walked further for less. She knocked on the door with more confidence than she felt. Alex opened it, expecting an older woman. He got Clara instead. He looked at her for a long moment, too long in a way that made her chin lift slightly, refusing to be studied like livestock at an auction. "You," he said finally, and it wasn't kind. It wasn't cruel either. It was just startled the way a man sounds when reality doesn't match what he'd already decided in his head. "You hired a cook," Clara said evenly. "I'm applying for the position. You're alone." "Yes." "You walked here, Mool?" 10 miles. Something flickered across his face. Disbelief, maybe, or the beginning of respect he wasn't ready to admit to. No woman walks 10 miles for a cooking job. Clara lifted her suitcase slightly, as if to remind him she was still standing there, still waiting, still tired in a way that had nothing to do with her legs. "Then I suppose I'm not an ordinary woman." For a moment, Alex almost closed the door. The old version of himself. The version that had existed before Margaret. The version that trusted people. The version that let strangers into his life without suspicion that version was long buried on the hill next to his wife. But something stopped his hand. Maybe it was the way she stood. Not begging, not shrinking. Just tired and honest about it, in a way most people who came asking him for something never bothered to be. "You know this ranch isn't easy work," he said, his voice lower now, testing her. "Neither was my life before I got here," Clara answered without hesitation. That surprised him more than he let on. "Why should I hire you?" he asked. "There'll be other women, older women, women with references." Clara looked past him into the house, the dim hallway, the closed doors, the silence that seemed to live in the walls like mold nobody had bothered to clean. Then she looked back at him and smiled. Not a performance. Not the kind of smile women learned to paste on for men who held their next meal in their hands. A real smile. Small and a little sad and entirely her own. "The better question, Mr. Whitmore," she said, "is why a man with a house this size lets it feel this empty." Alex Whitmore had no answer. For the first time in 5 years, someone had looked straight past his money and his land and seen exactly what he'd been hiding, and she'd said it out loud to his face without a single ounce of fear. He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "We'll see if you can cook as well as you talk." So, word travels fast on a ranch with 30 hands and not much else to gossip about. By supper that first evening, everyone from Samuel Reed down to the youngest stable boy knew that Alexander Whitmore had hired a young widow to run his kitchen, and half of them had already formed an opinion about what that meant. "Bet she won't last the week," muttered one of the older hands, a wiry man named Garrett, as he leaned against the corral fence. "Boss ain't exactly easy to please." "Bet she leaves faster than that," said another, nodding toward the house. 10 miles on foot for a cooking job. Something ain't right about a woman that desperate." Samuel Reed, who'd worked the Whitmore land longer than anyone, said nothing. He'd learned a long time ago that judging a person before you'd eaten a single meal they'd cooked was a fool's game. He'd wait and see. Inside, Clara wasted no time. She walked into the kitchen that first afternoon and stopped cold in the doorway, hand pressed briefly to her chest, taking in what she saw, the way a doctor might take in a patient who'd been neglected far too long. The shelves were half empty, coated in dust. The stove sat cold, its iron surface dull with disuse. Pots hung crooked on their hooks, some of them rusted at the edges. It looked less like a working kitchen, and more like a room someone had simply given up on. Alex appeared in the doorway a moment later, arms crossed, watching her survey the wreckage of his own neglect. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Saving your kitchen," Clara said without looking at him, already pulling flour tins down from a high shelf. "My kitchen is fine." She turned one eyebrow raised, taking in the dust on her fingertips before wiping them on her apron. "Your kitchen looks like it gave up on life, Mr. Whitmore. Much like the rest of this house from what I can tell." For a moment, something sharp flashed behind Alex's eyes, the kind of anger a man carries when someone gets too close to a truth he's spent years avoiding. His jaw tightened, his hands closed briefly at his sides. Then against every instinct he had, the corner of his mouth twitched. He almost laughed. Almost. "You've got a mouth on you," he said instead, turning to leave before she could see whatever expression had nearly broken through. "So I've been told," Clara called after him, already rolling up her sleeves. Usually right before people decide they like me anyway. He didn't answer, but he didn't walk away as fast as he meant to either. That first supper changed something in the house, though nobody could have said exactly what or exactly when. The ranch hands filed into the long dining hall expecting the usual beans, hard bread, maybe a thin stew if they were lucky. Instead, the smell hit them before they'd even sat down. Roasted chicken herbs, Clara had found growing wild near the creek biscuits so soft they nearly fell apart at the touch. Gravy, rich enough to make grown men go quiet with the first bite. For a moment, nobody spoke at all. Then the youngest hand on the ranch, a boy of maybe 17, named Danny, set down his fork with something close to reverence in his eyes. "My mother used to make bread like this," he said quietly, almost to himself. Back before she passed. The table went still. Clara standing near the doorway, watching the meal she'd prepared disappear. Plate by plate, felt something tighten in her throat. She walked over, rested a gentle hand briefly on the boy's shoulder, and said the only thing that felt true. "Then your mother gave you a memory worth keeping, Danny. That's more than most people get." Danny nodded, blinking fast, and went back to his food without another word. At the head of the table, Alex sat mostly silent, watching the room the way a man watches something he doesn't quite understand yet. He watched Samuel Reed, a man who rarely smiled at anything, laugh at something Garrett said. He watched Danny, quiet and grieving in his own private way, look a little lighter than he had an hour ago. He watched 30 tired, hardened men remember for one meal at least what it felt like to sit at a table that felt like home. And he realized something that hit him harder than he expected. His ranch hadn't been empty because there was no food on the table. It had been empty because there'd been no warmth in the house at all. And this woman, this stranger, who'd walked 10 miles with nothing but a suitcase and a stubborn kind of grace, had brought that warmth back into his home without seeming to try at all. It terrified him a little how much that realization cost him to admit. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them expected. Clara rose before dawn, the way she always had, moving through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a woman who'd learned to work hard and complain little. She scrubbed the stove until it gleamed. She found the good dishes buried in a cabinet nobody had opened in years and put them back into use. She planted a small garden behind the kitchen door. Tomatoes, herbs, a stubborn row of beans that refused to grow straight, and tended it in the early morning light before the men woke for chores. Alex told himself he wasn't watching her. He was, of course. Every morning from the study window or the porch or wherever his work happened to take him. He told himself it was simple curiosity, the way a man might watch weather change, nothing more. It became more than that faster than he wanted to admit. "Your coffee is terrible," Clara informed him one morning, setting a fresh cup in front of him at the small kitchen table where he'd started without quite deciding to taking his morning meal instead of eating alone in his study. "It's coffee," Alex said. "It does the job." "It tastes like burnt dirt," Clara said, not unkindly, already reaching for the pot to fix it herself. "There's a difference between drinking coffee and punishing yourself, Mr. Whitmore." "Maybe I like punishing myself." The words slipped out before he meant them to, too honest, too close to something he never said out loud. Clara paused, coffee pot in hand, and looked at him with an expression that wasn't pity. He would have hated pity. It was something gentler than that. Something that looked for just a moment like understanding. "I know," she said quietly. "I did too for a while." Alex looked up. What changed? Clara set the pot down and took the seat across from him. Something she hadn't done before. Something that felt in that small kitchen like crossing an invisible line neither of them had drawn, but both of them understood. "I got tired of it," she said simply. "Grief is heavy enough without adding punishment on top of it. Eventually I decided I'd rather carry my husband's memory than carry my own guilt about being alive when he isn't." Alex said nothing for a long moment. "How do you still smile?" He finally asked the question, rougher than he intended, pulled out of him almost against his will. "After everything you told me, losing your husband, the town turning on you, walking here with nothing. How does a person go through all that and still—" He gestured vaguely at her, at the warmth she carried into every room she entered. Clara considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. "Because if I let the world take my smile too," she said finally, "then they'd have taken everything, Mr. Whitmore, my husband, my home, my name in that town. I decided a long time ago there was one thing they couldn't have, and that was how I chose to face the next morning." Those words settled into Alex's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples he could feel long after she'd risen from the table and gone back to her work. He had money. He had land stretching further than any man could ride in a morning. But Clara Bennett, a woman who'd lost nearly everything, had something he had buried 5 years ago on a hill overlooking the north pasture. Hope. And for the first time since Margaret's death, Alex Whitmore wanted some of it for himself. It wasn't just Alex who noticed the change. Samuel Reed, watching from the corral one afternoon, as Alex actually laughed out loud at something Clara said, while hanging laundry near the kitchen door, pulled his hat down lower, and allowed himself a rare smile of his own. "Would you look at that?" he murmured to Garrett, who was mending a bit of fence nearby. Garrett glanced over, watched for a moment, and shook his head slowly. "Never thought I'd see the boss smile like that again, not since Mrs. Whitmore." "Don't say that too loud," Samuel warned. "Man like him, he'll close right back up if he thinks folks are watching too close." But it was hard not to watch. Hard not to notice the small things, the way Alex started coming in from the fields earlier in time for supper, instead of eating alone hours later. The way he'd started asking Clara about her day, actually listening to the answer, instead of nodding along out of politeness. The way the house itself seemed to breathe again. Windows open to let in the summer air instead of shut tight against a world Alex had spent 5 years trying to keep out. Even Danny noticed. "Boss seems different," he said one evening, helping Clara carry dishes back to the kitchen after supper. Better, I mean, since you got here. Clara smiled but said nothing, focusing instead on the stack of plates in her hands. She'd noticed the change too, of course. She'd have had to be blind not to. But noticing it and trusting it were two very different things, and trust wasn't something Clara Bennett handed out easily anymore. Not after Millbrook. Not after watching an entire town decide who she was based on rumors and half-truths. She liked Alex Whitmore more than she meant to. That much she could admit, if only to herself, in the quiet moments before sleep took her each night in the small room off the kitchen that had become hers. But liking a man and trusting the world not to punish her for it again were very different things. 2 weeks after Clara's arrival, Alex sent her into town with a list of supplies and Samuel Reed as an escort, not because he didn't trust her alone, he told himself, but because the road could be dangerous, and it was simple courtesy. Clara knew better. She recognized the look in his eyes when he'd handed her the list that morning, something careful, something protective, something that made her chest tighten in a way she didn't examine too closely. Silver Creek wasn't a large town, but it was large enough to have opinions, and those opinions found Clara the moment she stepped through the door of the general store. "You're the widow living out at the Whitmore place," Mrs. Caldwell said, not quite a question, her eyes sweeping over Clara with open curiosity as she counted out change. "Cooking for him, they say." "That's right," Clara said evenly, keeping her voice light despite the way her shoulders had gone tense. "Must be strange." Mrs. Caldwell continued, leaning slightly across the counter. "Living alone out there with a man like that. Big house. Just the two of you mostly from what I hear." "There are 30 ranch hands on that property, Mrs. Caldwell," Clara said, an edge creeping into her tone despite her best efforts. "I assure you I'm hardly alone with him." Of course," Mrs. Caldwell said, though her smile suggested she didn't quite believe it or didn't care to. "Where did you say you were from again, dear, before Silver Creek?" Clara's fingers tightened slightly around the coins in her palm. "Ohio," she said carefully. "Millbrook." Something shifted in Mrs. Caldwell's expression, small, almost imperceptible, but Clara had spent 2 years learning to read exactly that kind of flicker on a stranger's face. Recognition. The beginning of a memory, trying to place itself. "Millbrook," Mrs. Caldwell repeated slowly. "That name sounds familiar somehow. My sister's husband does business up that way sometimes." "Bennett, you said your name was—" "Yes," Clara said, her voice tighter now, the old fear rising in her throat like something she'd swallowed too fast. "Clara Bennett." "Bennett," Mrs. Caldwell murmured again, tapping one finger against the counter, clearly trying to chase down a memory that hadn't fully surfaced yet. "I feel like I've heard that name somewhere before. Can't quite place it, though. I should finish my shopping," Clara said quickly, gathering her supplies with hands that weren't quite steady. "Mr. Reed is waiting." She left the store faster than she'd entered it, her heart pounding in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Samuel Reed noticed her silence on the ride back to the ranch, though he didn't press her about it. He'd learned enough about people in his years working the Whitmore land to know that silence sometimes needed room to breathe, not questions to fill it. But when they passed the edge of town, Samuel glanced back once, and what he saw made something uneasy settle in his stomach. A man on horseback watching them from beside the saloon. A stranger, not a rancher, not dressed for it. His clothes were too fine, his horse too well groomed for a working man's mount. He wasn't looking at the road or the town or anything else. He was looking at Clara. Samuel said nothing, but he kept his hand a little closer to his rifle for the rest of the ride, and he made a mental note to mention the stranger to Alex the moment they returned. Clara, riding beside him, hadn't noticed the man at all. Her mind was still tangled in Mrs. Caldwell's half-formed recognition, in the sound of her own maiden name hanging in the air of that store like something dangerous, something she'd tried so hard to bury under a new life, a new town, a new chance. It's nothing she told herself over and over, the way she'd told herself the same lie 100 times before it finally became true, or close enough to true, that she could live with it. She doesn't remember. It's a common enough name. It's nothing. But some part of her, The part that had learned the hard way, exactly how fast a good life could unravel, wasn't so sure. That evening, supper passed with its usual warmth. Danny recounting some small disaster with a stubborn calf Garrett and Samuel trading good-natured insults across the table. Clara moving between the kitchen and the dining hall with the easy grace that had become as familiar to the household as sunrise. But Alex noticed something was different the moment she set his plate down. "You're quiet tonight?" he said once the ranch hands had cleared out, and it was just the two of them left at the long table the way it had become most evenings. "I'm fine," Clara said, though the smile she offered didn't quite reach her eyes. Clara. Just her name. Nothing more. But something in the way he said it, steady, patient, like a man who'd learned to wait for the truth instead of demanding it, made her shoulders drop slightly, the careful mask slipping just enough for him to see underneath. "Someone in town recognized my name today," she said finally, staring at her hands folded on the table. "Or almost did. Mrs. Caldwell. She couldn't quite place it, but she will eventually. People always do in the end." "What happens then?" Alex asked quietly. Clara looked up at him, and for a moment all the fear she'd been carrying since Millbrook was written plainly across her face. "Then everyone here learns what everyone in Millbrook decided about me," she said. "That my husband was a thief, or close enough to one that it didn't matter what the truth actually was. That I probably knew about the money he lost or should have. That a woman who ends up alone and desperate enough to walk 10 miles for a cooking job probably deserved whatever happened to bring her that low." "That's not what I think," Alex said, his voice low and certain in a way that surprised them both. "You don't know the whole story yet," Clara said. "Then tell me." Clara hesitated, the weight of 2 years of silence pressing against her chest. But something about the way Alex was looking at her, steady, unafraid, waiting without judgment, made the words come easier than she expected. "My husband Thomas trusted a business partner who turned out to be a liar," she said quietly. "The man forged papers, took our savings, and vanished before anyone could prove anything against him. Thomas's name was on the documents. Mine too in places, because I'd signed things I didn't fully understand at the time. When the partner disappeared, the town decided we were both guilty of something, even though we'd lost everything too. Thomas died 8 months later. His heart, the doctor said. I think it was shame." Alex was quiet for a long moment, absorbing every word. "And you carried that alone," he said finally. "For 2 years. I didn't have a choice." "You have one now," Alex said, and something in his voice made Clara look up sharply. "Whatever they decided about you in Millbrook, whatever Mrs. Caldwell remembers or doesn't remember, none of that changes what you've done here, what you've brought back into this house, into this ranch." "You barely know me, Alex," Clara said softly, using his first name for the first time, the intimacy of it surprising them both. "I know enough," Alex said. "I know you walked 10 miles rather than give up on finding better work. I know you feed 30 men like they're your own family every single night. I know you told a grieving boy his mother gave him something worth keeping, and I know you did the same thing for me without even realizing it." Clara's eyes glistened, though she blinked the emotion back before it could fall. "The woman who walked into this ranch 2 weeks ago wasn't a problem to be managed." Alex continued, his voice roughening slightly. "She was the first person who made this place feel like it was alive again. And I'm not about to let some half-remembered gossip from a storekeeper's wife change that." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The kitchen around them had gone quiet, the house settling into its evening stillness, and something passed between them that neither one was quite ready to name out loud. "Thank you," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't thank me yet." Alex said something grim, creeping back into his expression. "Samuel mentioned a stranger watching you in town today, well-dressed, not a rancher. I don't like the sound of that, not after everything you've just told me." Clara felt the warmth of the moment before drained slightly from her chest, replaced by the old familiar chill of fear she'd hoped she'd left behind in Millbrook. "Someone was watching me. Samuel didn't like the look of him," Alex said. "Neither do I now that I know what you're carrying. I want you to stay close to the house for the next few days, just until we know more." Clara nodded slowly, though the fear in her chest hadn't fully settled. She thought she'd left her past 2 years and 800 miles behind her. She was about to learn exactly how wrong she was. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the Whitmore Ranch, addressed not to Alex, but to Clara. She recognized the handwriting the moment she saw it, and her blood ran cold before she'd even broken the seal. It was a name from Millbrook, a name she'd hoped never to see again, and whoever had sent it knew exactly where to find her. Clara's hands trembled as she broke the seal. The handwriting on the outside was neat. Too neat. The kind of neat a man practiced when he wanted people to trust him before they'd read a single word he'd written. She read the first line and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "I know exactly where you are now, Mrs. Bennet, and I know exactly what you're worth to me if you keep your mouth shut about Millbrook." She didn't read the rest. She couldn't. Her fingers folded the letter back along its original creases, quick and clumsy, as if hiding it fast enough might undo the fact that she'd already seen it. "Clara?" Alex's voice came from the kitchen doorway, and she jumped so hard the letter nearly slipped from her hand. "It's nothing," she said too fast, tucking it into her apron pocket. "That's the second time this week you've told me something's nothing, when it very clearly isn't." Alex crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe, his eyes steady on her face in a way that made lying to him feel impossible. "Who's the letter from?" "No one you need to worry about." "Clara." Just her name again. That same patient wait he'd used 3 nights before, the one that had cracked her open the first time. It worked again now, though she hated how easily it worked. She pulled the letter back out and handed it to him without another word. She watched his face change as he read it. Watched the color drain slightly from beneath his tan. Watched his jaw tighten. Watched something dangerous settle into his eyes that she hadn't seen from him before. Not even the day she'd told him about Thomas. "Who is this?" His voice had gone flat and hard. "I don't know," Clara admitted. "There's no name, just initials at the bottom." Alex flipped the letter over. "VH. I don't recognize them," Clara said, though something in the back of her mind itched at the letters, some half-buried memory she couldn't quite pull to the surface. "Thomas never mentioned anyone with those initials." "Whoever it is knows you're here," Alex said. "Knows your married name, knows Millbrook. That's not a stranger guessing Clara. That's someone who's been watching." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, the kitchen suddenly feeling too large and too cold, despite the stove burning steady behind her. "What if it's someone from the town? Someone who followed me here to finish what they started back home?" "Then they picked the wrong ranch to do it on," Alex said, and there was nothing soft in his voice now, nothing hesitant, just the flat, certain tone of a man who had already decided something and wasn't going to be argued out of it. "You're not facing this alone, not this time." Clara looked up at him, and for a moment the fear in her chest eased just slightly, replaced by something she hadn't let herself feel in 2 years. Safety. She should have known better than to trust it. Jam, chunk. 3 days later, Silver Creek got its first look at Richard Holloway, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath the moment he rode in. He arrived in a black carriage too fine for a frontier town, pulled by matched horses that had clearly never worked a day of ranch labor in their lives. He wore a suit instead of denim, and his boots didn't have a speck of dust on them despite the road he'd traveled. "Who in the world is that?" Danny asked, peering out the store window alongside half the other young men in town. "Money," Old Pete said, simply not looking up from his pipe. "That's what that is. Nothing but money wearing a fancy coat." Holloway didn't waste time on pleasantries. Within a day, word had spread that he'd requested a meeting with every rancher who held land along the northern ridge. Alex Whitmore first among them, since Alex's spread was the largest and the most valuable. He arrived at the Whitmore Ranch on a bright afternoon, stepping down from his carriage with the easy confidence of a man who'd never once in his life been told no, and meant to keep it that way. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, extending a hand with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Richard Holloway. I've heard a great deal about your operation. Finest cattle in the valley, they tell me. That's what they tell everyone who owns cattle, Alex said, shaking his hand once briefly without warmth. What can I do for you, Mr. Holloway? Straight to business. I respect that. Holloway smiled wider. I represent a group of investors interested in expanding operations in this valley. Your northern acreage, the ridgeland, mostly unused from what I understand, would suit our purposes well. I'm prepared to offer a very generous sum. That land's not for sale, Alex said, before Holloway had even finished naming a figure. Something flickered behind Holloway's eyes, brief, controlled. But Clara, watching from the porch with a tray of lemonade she'd prepared out of habit, rather than genuine hospitality, caught it anyway. It wasn't disappointment. It was irritation. The particular irritation of a man unused to hearing the word no and unwilling to accept it as final. Everything's for sale, Mr. Whitmore, Holloway said smoothly, at the right price. Not this, Alex said. That ridge has been in my family for 3 generations. My father's buried up there next to my wife. I'm not selling it to strangers so they can build whatever they're planning to build. Holloway's smile didn't waver, but something colder crept into his voice. That's unfortunate. I do hope you'll reconsider. These things tend to go more smoothly when everyone cooperates. Is that a threat, Mr. Holloway? It's a courtesy, Holloway said, tipping his hat. One I extend exactly once. His eyes drifted almost lazily toward the porch, toward Clara standing there with her tray. Her spine straight, her expression carefully neutral, despite the way her pulse had quickened the moment he'd looked at her. And who is this lovely woman? Holloway asked, his tone shifting into something oily and pleasant. I don't believe we've met, my cook, Alex said, stepping slightly, almost imperceptibly between them. She's not part of this conversation. Of course not, Holloway said, though his eyes lingered on Clara a moment too long before he finally turned back to his carriage. I'll leave you to think over my offer, Mr. Whitmore. I have a feeling we'll speak again soon. He climbed into his carriage and rode off down the drive, and Clara didn't breathe easy again until the dust from his wheels had fully settled. I don't like him, she said quietly. Neither do I, Alex said, watching the carriage disappear around the bend. And I like him even less now that he's looked at you the way he just did. Neither of them said what they were both thinking. That Richard Holloway looked at people the way a man looks at something he intends to own. The rumors got worse before they got better. 2 days after Holloway's visit, Clara rode into town with Samuel again, this time for supplies she'd normally have sent one of the ranch hands to fetch, except Alex had insisted quietly, firmly, that she not go anywhere alone until they understood what they were dealing with. She should have listened to her instincts and stayed home. The moment she stepped into the general store, the conversation between 2 women near the counter stopped dead, replaced by a silence so sudden and so loaded that Clara felt it like a physical thing pressing against her chest. Mrs. Bennett, one of the women said, a thin, sharp-faced woman. Clara didn't recognize her voice, syrupy in a way that made every hair on Clara's arms rise. Or should I say Mrs. Thomas Bennett, from Millbrook. Clara's stomach dropped straight through the floor. I'm sorry, do I know you? No, the woman said, smiling in a way that had nothing kind in it at all. But my cousin lives in Millbrook. Wrote me the strangest letter last week. Said a woman matching your description had turned up out here cooking for one of the wealthiest men in the valley. Said I ought to warn people given what happened back home. I don't know what you're talking about, Clara said, her voice tight, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Don't you? The woman's smile widened. Your husband stole from half the town before he died, didn't he? And you knew about it the whole time, according to what my cousin heard. Signed the papers yourself, they say. Convenient, don't you think, that you managed to walk away from all that debt and land yourself in the home of the richest man in Silver Creek? The store had gone completely silent. Every eye had turned toward Clara, and she felt each one of them like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, dragging her back into the exact nightmare she'd walked 10 miles to escape. That's not what happened, Clara said, her voice shaking now, despite her best efforts to hold it steady. My husband was deceived by his business partner. We lost everything too, I never signed anything I understood to be fraudulent. That's not what I heard, the woman said, clearly enjoying herself now the way certain people enjoyed watching someone else drown. I heard you knew exactly what your husband was doing and let him take the blame while you— That's enough. Samuel Reed's voice cut through the store like a gunshot, and every head turned toward the doorway where he stood arms crossed, his expression harder than Clara had ever seen it. Mrs. Bennett doesn't owe you or anyone else in this store an explanation of her past, Samuel said, stepping fully inside. And I'd think real careful, ma'am, before you go spreading gossip. You heard secondhand from a cousin who wasn't even there. The sharp-faced woman's smile faltered slightly under Samuel's glare, though she recovered quickly. I'm simply saying what people are saying, Mr. Reed. Surely you can't blame a town for being cautious about who's living out on the Whitmore land. I can blame a town for being cruel, Samuel said flatly. There's a difference, and you know it. Clara didn't wait to hear the rest. She grabbed the few supplies she'd already gathered, paid for them with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and walked out of the store with her chin held high, refusing to let a single tear fall until she was safely back in the wagon, the town shrinking behind her. You did nothing wrong, Samuel said quietly once they were well clear of Silver Creek. Whatever they're saying in there, Boss knows it. I know it. Anyone with sense knows it. It doesn't matter what's true, Samuel, Clara said, staring at her hands folded tight in her lap. It only matters what people decide to believe. I learned that lesson once already. Apparently, I needed to learn it twice. Alex was waiting on the porch when the wagon returned, and one look at Clara's face told him everything he needed to know before Samuel had even climbed down to explain. What happened? Nothing I haven't survived before, Clara said, trying to walk past him into the house. Alex caught her arm gently but firmly enough to stop her. Clara, what happened? Samuel filled in the details Clara wouldn't, his voice low and controlled, despite the anger clearly simmering underneath. By the time he'd finished, Alex's hands had curled into fists at his sides. His jaw locked so tight, Clara could see the muscle working beneath his skin. I'm going into town, he said. Alex, don't. Clara grabbed his sleeve, alarmed by the fury she saw building behind his eyes. It won't help. It'll just give them more to talk about. I don't care what they talk about, Alex said. I care that a woman stood in a public store and accused you of something you had nothing to do with, and half that town let her do it without a single word in your defense. Samuel defended me. Samuel shouldn't have had to. Alex's voice cracked slightly on the words raw in a way that surprised them both. I should have been there. I should have— He stopped himself, breathing hard, and Clara realized with a jolt that this wasn't just anger on her behalf. This was something closer to fear. The fear of a man who'd already lost one woman he loved and couldn't stand the thought of losing another piece of his life to something he couldn't control. Alex, Clara said softly, reaching up to rest her hand against his jaw, feeling the tension there beneath her palm. Look at me. He did finally, his eyes dark and stormy, and achingly honest, in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. I've survived worse than gossip, Clara said. I survived losing Thomas. I survived losing my home, my name, everything I thought I knew about my own life. I can survive a sharp-tongued woman in a general store. You shouldn't have to survive it alone, Alex said. Not anymore. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them expected, and for a moment, neither one moved. Clara's hand was still resting against his jaw. Alex's hand had drifted almost without his permission to rest against the small of her back, drawing her the smallest fraction closer. Alex, I know, he said quietly, though he didn't step back. I know it's too soon. I know you've got no reason to trust another man with your heart, not after everything. But I need you to know that whatever's coming that letter Holloway, whatever this town decides to whisper about you, I'm not stepping back from this. From you. Clara's breath caught. For one long suspended moment, she thought he might kiss her, and some traitorous part of her chest ached for exactly that. Then Danny came sprinting around the corner of the barn, breathless, cutting through the moment like a blade. Boss, you gotta come see this. There's men up on the north ridge surveying the land. Started this morning, near the Fletcher boundary. Alex and Clara broke apart. The spell shattered both of them, turning toward Danny with matching expressions of alarm. Surveying? Alex repeated. On my land. Yes, sir. Got equipment and everything. Samuel already rode up to run them off, but they claim they got permission. Permission from who? Alex's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Danny swallowed hard. They said Mr. Holloway sent them. Tuh. Alex rode for the North Ridge with fury he hadn't felt in years, burning through his chest. Clara's fear from the store still fresh in his mind, tangled now with this new violation crawling up his spine like ice water. He found Samuel already there, standing between two strangers, with surveying equipment and a stretch of his family's land, his rifle not quite raised, but close enough to make his position clear. These men say they've got a right to be here, Samuel said the moment Alex arrived, not taking his eyes off the strangers. Say Holloway's already secured legal access to survey the northern boundary. Legal access from who? Alex demanded, swinging down from his horse. This is my land. Has been since my grandfather claimed it. One of the surveyors, a nervous-looking man with ink-stained fingers, pulled out a folded document with visibly shaking hands. We were told there's a boundary dispute, sir. Mr. Holloway's lawyers say part of this ridge falls outside your original deed. We're just here to confirm the property lines. Alex snatched the paper and scanned it fast, his eyes narrowing with every line. This is nonsense. My deed's clear. Filed with the county 20 years ago. There's apparently a second document, the surveyor said carefully, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. An older claim. Mr. Holloway's people say it predates yours. That's impossible, Alex said flatly. There is no older claim. My grandfather was the first man to file on this ridge. I'm just doing the job I was hired for, sir, the surveyor said, backing away slowly. You'll want to take it up with Mr. Holloway directly. Alex watched them pack up their equipment and retreat down the ridge, his mind racing through everything Holloway had said 2 days earlier, the generous offer, the veiled threat, the smiling insistence that everything was for sale at the right price. These things tend to go more smoothly when everyone cooperates. He's not just trying to buy the land, Alex said slowly, the realization settling over him like a physical weight. He's trying to steal it. Manufacture some fake claim, tie it up in courts long enough to force me into selling just to make the headache stop. Boss, that takes serious money and serious connections to pull off, Samuel said. Forging land claims ain't the kind of thing a man does without help. Somebody with real skill at making false papers look real. Something cold slid down Alex's spine. A man skilled at forging documents. A letter signed only with initials threatening a woman who'd already survived exactly that kind of betrayal once before. Samuel, Alex said slowly, I need you to find out everything you can about who Richard Holloway travels with. Every man in his employ. Every lawyer. Every clerk. Every associate who's come into this valley with him. You thinking what I'm thinking? I'm thinking, Alex said grimly, already turning his horse back toward the ranch, back toward Clara. That this might be bigger than a land dispute. Bud. It took 2 more days for Samuel to bring back the answer, and when he did, he rode into the yard so fast his horse was lathered white with sweat. Boss, you need to hear this. Alex met him at the barn, Clara close behind both of them, reading the urgency on Samuel's face before he'd even dismounted. I talked to a fella who used to work the hotel in the next county over, Samuel said, breathing hard. Said Holloway's got a man traveling with him. Handles all his paperwork, contracts, land claims. Real quiet type. Never uses his full name in front of strangers, just goes by his initials. Clara's blood went cold. What initials? She said, though some part of her already knew the answer before Samuel spoke it. V.H., Samuel said. Fella at the hotel said everybody calls him just that. Never heard a first name. Real particular about his handwriting, too. Apparently, he's the one draws up every document Holloway uses. Said the man's got a gift for making forged papers look older than they are. Said in his last town, some folks got real hurt by documents that man drew up. Ruined more than one family before Holloway moved his operation west. Clara's knees nearly gave out beneath her. Clara. Alex caught her elbow, alarmed by the way all the color had drained from her face. What is it? Victor Hale. Clara whispered the name, tasting like poison on her tongue, 2 years of buried grief and rage surging up all at once. That's who ruined Thomas. That's the business partner who forged the papers and vanished with everything we owned. VH. It's him. It has to be him. The pieces slammed together in Alex's mind with sickening clarity. The letter threatening Clara into silence about Millbrook. The forged land claim threatening to steal his family's ridge. They weren't two separate threats. They were the same man working for the same employer, running the same con he'd run in Millbrook. Except this time, the stakes were an entire valley's worth of land and water instead of one grieving widow's savings. He's here, Clara said, horror dawning across her face as the full weight of it settled in. He's actually here, Alex, working for Holloway. The man who destroyed my husband, who destroyed my life, and he's standing in the same town where I've finally started to build something again. He won't touch you. Alex said, his voice low and lethal in a way Clara had never heard from him before. Not while I'm breathing. Alex, you don't understand what this man is capable of. He ruined Thomas without anyone ever proving a single thing against him. He's careful. He's patient. He disappears the moment anyone gets close to the truth. Then we'll be more careful than he is, Alex said. And we won't let him disappear this time. That evening, as the ranch settled into its usual quiet rhythm, Clara found herself standing on the porch long after supper had been cleared away, staring out at the dark shape of the northern ridge against the fading sky. The place where 3 generations of Whitmores were buried. The place Holloway wanted to steal, using the same twisted skill that had destroyed her husband. She heard Alex's footsteps behind her before he spoke. You should be inside, he said gently. It's cold. I keep thinking about Thomas, Clara said quietly, not turning around. About how scared he must have been at the end. Knowing everyone believed the worst of him. Knowing he couldn't prove otherwise, no matter what he did. I used to think it was shame that killed him. Now I wonder if it was just exhaustion. The exhaustion of fighting something nobody else could see. You're not fighting alone this time, Alex said, coming to stand beside her. Neither was Thomas in a way, Clara said. He had me, and it still wasn't enough to save him. I'm not going to let that happen to you, Alex said, turning her gently to face him. I mean that, Clara. Whatever Holloway and this Victor Hale are planning, whatever they think they can do to either of us, they're about to learn they picked the wrong ranch and the wrong woman to try it on. Clara looked up at him, searching his face for any hint of doubt, and finding none. Why do you care this much? She asked softly. You barely knew me a month ago. Alex reached up, brushing a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. Because somewhere in the last month, he said quietly, you stopped being my cook and started being the reason I actually want to come home at the end of the day. Clara's heart pounded so hard, she was certain he could hear it. Alex, I know it's not the right time, he said, though he didn't pull away. I know we've got Holloway to deal with, and Hale, and a whole town full of people ready to believe the worst about you before they've heard a word of the truth. But I needed you to know that. Before any of this gets worse. For a moment, the danger circling both of them seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant, replaced by the warmth of his hand still resting against her cheek. The steadiness in his eyes, the quiet certainty in his voice that no one had offered her in longer than she could remember. She rose onto her toes, and for one breathless second, she thought she might finally let herself have this one good thing. Then a horse thundered into the yard, hooves pounding hard against the packed earth, and both of them jumped apart as Garrett came sliding down from his saddle, his face pale and urgent, in the lamplight spilling from the windows. Boss, you need to come quick. It's Mr. Holloway, he's here, and he's brought the sheriff with him. Alex's blood turned to ice. The sheriff? Why in God's name would he bring the sheriff out here at this hour? Garrett swallowed hard, his eyes flicking briefly apologetically toward Clara. He says he's got a warrant, boss. Says he's got proof of fraud committed back in Ohio. Says the woman responsible is living right here on your ranch, and he means to see her arrested tonight. Sheriff Wade Dawson swung down from his horse slower than a man eager to do his job, his hat brim low, his eyes carefully avoiding Clara's, the moment he stepped into the lamplight. "Alex," he said, nodding once. "Wish I was here on friendlier business." "Then don't do this business, Wade," Alex said, planting himself between the sheriff and the porch steps where Clara stood frozen, one hand gripping the railing hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "Whatever Holloway's told you, it's a lie. I'm not here on Mr. Holloway's word alone," Dawson said, though he had the decency to look uncomfortable saying it. "I've got a signed complaint and a warrant properly filed through the county judge this afternoon. Fraud charges out of Millbrook, Ohio. Says here the woman goes by Clara Bennett." Richard Holloway stepped down from his carriage behind the sheriff, smoothing his coat with the unhurried satisfaction of a man watching a plan click neatly into place. "I did try to warn you, Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice dripping with false regret. "These things go so much smoother when everyone cooperates." "You son of a—" Alex started forward, and it took Samuel's hand hard on his shoulder to stop him. "Boss, not like this. Not in front of the sheriff." Alex forced himself, still his chest heaving, his eyes never leaving Holloway's smug, satisfied face. "Let me see the complaint," Alex said, his voice shaking with the effort of controlling it. Dawson handed over the paper, and Alex scanned it fast, his stomach turning colder with every line. A signature at the bottom. A name he didn't recognize. A claim that Clara Bennett had knowingly forged financial documents in Millbrook 2 years prior, defrauding local businessmen of nearly $4,000. "This is garbage," Alex said. "Who signed this? I've never heard this name in my life." "A Mr. Elias Crane," Dawson said. "Claims to be a former business associate of the late Thomas Bennett. Says he's been trying to track down the widow for 2 years to recover what he's owed." Clara made a small strangled sound from the porch, and every head turned toward her. "There is no Elias Crane," she said, her voice trembling, but clear. "I have never once heard that name. Not from Thomas, not from anyone in Millbrook." "That's convenient," Holloway said smoothly, "given how much you claim not to remember about your husband's business dealings." "I remember everything about my husband's business dealings." Clara snapped, some of her fear burning away into fury. "I remember the man who actually ruined us. His name was Victor Hale. And unless I'm very much mistaken, Mr. Holloway, he's the same man drawing up your land claims on the northern ridge." The yard went dead silent. Holloway's smile flickered just for a heartbeat, just long enough for Alex to see it before he smoothed his expression back into practiced calm. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," Holloway said. "My associates are men of excellent reputation." "Then bring this Elias Crane here," Alex said, rounding on Dawson. "Let him say these accusations to Clara's face in front of witnesses, instead of hiding behind a signature on a piece of paper." "That's not how warrants work, Alex, and you know it," Dawson said wearily. "I've got a legal document. I've got a duty to bring her in for questioning at minimum. Judge Perry will hear the matter properly in 3 days' time." 3 days? Clara whispered, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. "You are not taking her anywhere tonight," Alex said, stepping fully between Dawson and the porch, his voice dropping into something low and absolute. "Not without a fight you don't want to have with me, Wade." "Alex, I'll post whatever bond you need," Alex said. "I'll stand as surety for her myself. I'll ride to Judge Perry's house right now, if that's what it takes. But I am not letting you drag an innocent woman off my property in the middle of the night on the word of a man who doesn't exist, and a businessman who spent the last week trying to steal my land." Dawson looked between Alex's furious face and Clara's terrified one, clearly weighing the cost of pushing the matter against a man with Alex Whitmore's standing in the valley. "Post the bond," Dawson said finally, "and she stays here under your custody until the hearing. But Alex, if she runs that bond and a good deal more comes down on you, you understand that?" "She's not running," Alex said. "She's got nothing to run from." Holloway watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, his satisfaction visibly curdling into irritation at having his plan slowed rather than stopped entirely. 3 days, Mrs. Bennet, he said, tipping his hat toward Clara with mocking politeness. I do hope you use them wisely. He climbed back into his carriage without another word, and Clara didn't breathe again, until the sound of his wheels had faded completely down the drive. The moment Dawson and Holloway were gone, Clara's legs finally gave out, and she sank onto the porch steps, her whole body shaking. Alex knelt in front of her, immediately taking both her hands in his. Clara, look at me. We have 3 days. We're going to use every single one of them. To do what, Alex? Her voice cracked. This Elias Crane doesn't exist. He can't. I would remember him. There's no way to prove a lie doesn't exist. We don't have to prove Crane's a liar, Alex said. We have to prove who's telling the lie for him, and I'd bet everything I own it traces straight back to Victor Hale. Samuel stepped closer, his expression grim. Boss, we don't even know where Hale is staying. Man like that, he don't exactly advertise himself. Then we find out, Alex said, rising to his feet, pulling Clara up gently with him. Tonight, if we have to. Alex, it's nearly midnight, Clara said, and in 3 days, a judge is going to decide whether you go to prison for something you never did, Alex said. I don't much care what time it is. Ciao. They found their first real lead before sunrise, though not the way any of them expected. Danny came pounding on the kitchen door just past 4 a.m, breathless, his face pale in the lamplight. Boss, Miss Clara, you need to come see this. Found something down by the old well past the south fence. They followed him through the dark lanterns swinging, and what they found made Clara's stomach drop straight through the ground. A man unconscious sprawled near the well, a nasty gash across his forehead, his fine clothes torn and muddied. That's him, Clara breathed, staggering back a step. That's Victor Hale. Alex knelt beside the unconscious man, checking for a pulse, finding one weak but steady. He's alive. Barely. Looks like somebody worked him over pretty good before dumping him out here. Who would do that? Danny asked wide-eyed. Alex's jaw tightened, as the answer settled over him with terrible clarity. Someone who needed him quiet before he could tell anyone the truth. Holloway. Clara said the name coming out like a curse. Get him inside, Alex ordered. Samuel, ride for the doctor. If this man dies before he can talk, we lose our only chance to prove any of this. Doc Riley arrived within the hour, working fast over Hale's battered body, while Clara paced the length of the parlor, her arms wrapped tight around herself. Alex watching her with worry etched into every line of his face. He'll live, Doc Riley announced, finally wiping his hands on a cloth. Concussion. Couple of cracked ribs. Whoever did this wanted to send a message more than kill him outright. He should wake within a few hours, though he'll be groggy. Thank you, Doc, Alex said. I need you to keep this quiet. Whoever attacked him can't know he's alive and under my roof. Doc Riley nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what Alex was asking. You've got my word, Alex. Whatever's going on, I trust you're on the right side of it. Once the doctor had gone, Clara finally allowed herself to sink into a chair, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and fear, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. If he wakes up, she said quietly, if he tells the truth about what Holloway's making him do, that could save me, that could prove everything. It could, Alex agreed. It could also get him killed the moment Holloway realizes he's still alive. Then we protect him. Clara said, some of her old fire returning to her voice. We keep him hidden until the hearing. We make sure he testifies before Holloway even knows he survived. Alex looked at her for a long moment. Something like pride mixing with the worry still etched across his face. There's the woman who walked 10 miles rather than give up, he said softly. I was wondering when she'd come back. Sound. Hale woke just past noon, groggy and disoriented, flinching hard the moment he saw Clara standing over him. You, he rasped, trying weakly to sit up before pain forced him back down. "You're supposed to hate me." "I do hate you," Clara said, her voice flat and cold. "You destroyed my husband. You destroyed my life. But right now, Victor, you're the only person alive who can stop the same thing from happening to me a second time." Hale's eyes darted between Clara and Alex, fear and shame warring plainly across his battered face. "Holloway did this to you," Alex said. It wasn't a question. Hale gave a short, bitter laugh that turned into a wince. "Holloway didn't do this himself. Man like him never gets his own hands dirty. But yes, his men, last night. I told him I wanted out, that framing Mrs. Bennett for something I did was one thing too far even for me." "So it's true," Clara said, her voice shaking despite her attempt at control. "You forged Elias Crane. He doesn't exist." "He exists," Hale said quietly, closing his eyes. "Just not the way the complaint says. Elias Crane is a real man. He's a bookkeeper who owes Holloway a debt so large he'll sign whatever's put in front of him. Holloway had me draft the fraud complaint, told Crane exactly what to sign, exactly what to claim. None of it's true. Not one word." "Why?" Clara demanded, tears finally breaking free despite her best efforts to hold them back. "Why do this to me, Victor? Wasn't Millbrook enough? Wasn't Thomas's death enough for you?" Hale flinched at the mention of Thomas, real grief flickering across his features for the first time. "I never meant for Thomas to die," he said quietly. "I was desperate back in Millbrook. Owed money to men far more dangerous than I ever was. I took your savings because I had no other way to cover the debt, and I told myself I'd pay it back before anyone noticed. I never imagined it would kill him. I've carried that every day since." "That doesn't excuse what you're doing to Clara now," Alex said, his voice hard. "No," Hale agreed, "it doesn't. But Holloway found me 8 months ago, threatened to expose everything I did in Millbrook unless I worked for him. I've been drafting his forged land claims for months. When he found out Clara Mrs. Bennett was living here working for you, he saw an opportunity too good to waste. Frame her for the very crime I actually committed. Use it to force you into selling this land, since a man defending an accused fraudster in his own home doesn't have much standing to fight a land dispute. That's why he wants my northern ridge," Alex said slowly, pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "It was never really about the ridge alone, was it?" Hale hesitated, glancing toward the door, as if Holloway himself might be listening. "There's a water source," he said finally, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Underground. Runs beneath most of the northern valley, but the deepest, most reliable point sits right beneath your ridge, Mr. Whitmore. Holloway's had surveyors confirm it months ago. Whoever controls that water controls every ranch for 50 miles in a dry year. He's not just after your land, he's after control of the entire valley." The room went silent, the weight of Hale's words settling over all three of them like a physical thing. "My God," Alex breathed. "He's not just trying to ruin me. He's trying to own everyone." By the time Samuel returned from town that evening, his face grim, the danger had grown even more urgent. "Boss word's already spreading about Clara's hearing," he said. "Half the town's talking like it's already decided. And I overheard something worse at the saloon. Holloway's men are asking around about a stranger who went missing last night. Somebody matching Hale's description." "They know he's alive?" Clara said, dread pooling cold in her stomach. "Or they're about to figure it out," Samuel said. "Boss, if Holloway realizes Hale's here talking, telling the truth, he's not going to sit back and let that happen." "Then we move fast," Alex said. "Samuel, I need you to ride for Judge Perry tonight. Tell him we have new evidence, a witness who can testify to the truth about this fraud complaint. See if he'll move the hearing up before Holloway has time to silence Hale for good." "And if Holloway tries something before then?" Samuel asked. Alex's expression turned to granite. "Then he'll find out exactly what happens to a man who threatens what's mine." That night, unable to sleep, Clara found herself once again standing on the porch, staring out at the dark shape of the northern ridge, the water hidden somewhere beneath it, worth more than every acre of land Holloway had already tried to steal. Alex found her there as he had once before, though this time, neither of them pretended the danger circling them was something distant. "You should try to rest," he said softly. "I can't," Clara admitted. "Every time I close my eyes I see that courtroom. I see Judge Perry believing Holloway's lies the way Millbrook believed them. I see myself losing everything all over again." "That's not going to happen," Alex said. "You can't promise me that, Alex." Her voice broke slightly. Nobody could promise Thomas that either, and look what happened to him. Alex turned her gently to face him, his hands warm and steady on her shoulders. "I'm not Thomas," he said quietly. "And you're not facing this the way you face Millbrook. You've got Hale's testimony. You've got Samuel writing for the judge right now. You've got 30 ranch hands who'd stand between you and any man fool enough to try and drag you off this property. And you've got me, Clara, for as long as you'll have me." Clara looked up at him, the fear in her chest warring with something warmer, something that had been growing steadily since the day she'd first walked 10 miles up his drive. "I'm scared." She admitted the words costing her more than she expected. "Not just of the hearing. Of this. Of you. Of how much I've started to need you when the last time I let myself need someone, I lost everything." "I'm scared too," Alex admitted, surprising her. "I buried my heart on that ridge with Margaret 5 years ago and told myself it was staying there. Then you walked up my drive with a suitcase and a stubborn kind of grace, and every wall I built came down, whether I wanted it to or not. Alex, I love you, Clara." He said the words simple and unguarded, in a way that stole the breath from her lungs. "I don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe the first night you called my kitchen a graveyard. Maybe the day you told a grieving boy his mother left him something worth keeping. But I do. And whatever happens at that hearing, whatever Holloway throws at us next, I need you to know that." Tears spilled freely down Clara's face now, though, for the first time in longer than she could remember, they weren't tears of grief. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have for weeks. I was just too afraid to say it out loud." Alex leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to step back to change her mind, to decide it was too much too soon. She didn't. The kiss was gentle at first, careful two people who'd both been broken, learning how to be careful with something fragile and new. Then Clara's hands rose to his jaw, pulling him closer, and Alex's arms wrapped around her, like he intended never to let her go again. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, both smiling, in a way neither had allowed themselves in years, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment entirely. Samuel rode into the yard hard and fast. His horse lathered his face grim, even in the dim lantern light. "Boss Judge Perry's agreed to move the hearing up tomorrow morning instead of 3 days, but that ain't the worst of it." "What happened?" Alex demanded, already moving toward him. "Holloway's men," Samuel said, breathing hard. "They rode past the judge's house not an hour after I left. I don't think it's a coincidence, boss. I think they know we've got Hale. I think they're closing in." As if summoned by the words themselves, a sudden orange glow lit up the night sky behind the barn, and Danny's terrified shout tore through the darkness. "Fire! The barn's on fire!" Alex was moving before the word fire had fully left Danny's mouth. "Get every man with a bucket down there now!" he shouted, already running toward the barn, Samuel right behind him. "Clara, stay back." "Like hell I will." Clara was already running too, grabbing a bucket from beside the well, her fear for Alex outweighing every ounce of caution she should have felt. The barn's east wall had caught fast flames licking up dry timber that hadn't seen rain in nearly 3 weeks, and the horses inside were screaming a sound that tore straight through Clara's chest and set every nerve in her body on fire alongside the wood. "The horses!" she screamed. "Danny Garrett, get those stalls open!" Alex bellowed, already hauling the barn doors wide despite the heat rolling off them in waves. "Everyone else form a line to the well." What followed was chaos and heat, and the acrid bite of smoke burning down every throat in the yard. 30 men and one determined widow working in a desperate unbroken chain buckets, passing hand to hand, while Danny and Garrett fought their way into the smoke, to free terrified kicking horses one by one. Clara's arms burned with the effort of it, her palms blistering against the rope handle of her bucket. But she didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't let herself think about anything except the next bucket, the next pair of hands, the next small victory against the flames eating through Alex's family barn. "It's not natural," Old Pete shouted at one point, staring at how fast the fire had spread despite the still night air. "Ain't no lightning tonight. Somebody set this." Alex's face, already grim with smoke, and effort hardened further at the words. Though he didn't stop working, didn't stop shouting orders, didn't let himself be pulled away from the fight in front of him, until the last horse had been freed, and the flames had finally mercifully begun to die back under the relentless assault of bucket after bucket of well water. By the time the fire was fully out, the eastern half of the barn stood scorched and ruined, but the horses were safe. The main structure held, and not a single man had been seriously hurt. Alex found Clara sitting exhausted against the water trough, her face streaked black with soot, her hands wrapped in a torn piece of her own apron where the blisters had broken raw. "You shouldn't have been out here," he said, dropping to his knees in front of her, taking her ruined hands gently in his own. "And let you fight a fire alone," Clara said, though her voice was hoarse from smoke. "Not a chance, Alex Whitmore." He pressed his forehead briefly against hers, relief and exhaustion and fury all tangled together in the gesture. "Pete's right," Samuel said grimly, walking up with a scrap of fabric in his hand. "Found this caught on the fence near where the fire started, soaked in kerosene." Alex took the fabric, his jaw tightening as he examined it. "Holloway, or Hale's attackers finishing the job they started on him," Samuel said, "making sure nobody in this house gets a full night's sleep before that hearing tomorrow." "It worked," Clara admitted quietly, staring at her ruined hands. "I don't think I could sleep now if I tried." They didn't sleep. Instead, the whole household gathered in the parlor as the sky outside began its slow slide toward dawn. Doc Riley summoned back to check on Hale, who'd been moved to safety in a hidden room off the cellar the moment the fire alarm had sounded, well away from any eyes that might report back to Holloway that he was still breathing. "He's stable," Doc Riley confirmed, though his expression was troubled. "But Alex, I need to tell you something. While I was checking on him, he told me things. About Holloway, about what's really happening in this valley." "We already know about the water," Alex said. "Not just the water," Doc Riley said grimly. "He's not stopping at your land, Alex. He's been quietly buying up debts on half the ranches along the northern ridge. Fletcher's place, the Morrison spread, even Old Pete's cousin's outfit near the county line. Man's been circling this valley like a vulture for the better part of a year, and nobody's noticed because he's been doing it through paper, through other men's names, through exactly the kind of forged documents Hale's been drafting for him." Clara's stomach turned. "How many families are we talking about?" "Hale counted at least 11, Doc Riley said. "Once Holloway controls your ridge and that water source, every one of those debts comes due at once. And not a single rancher in this valley will have the water to keep their herds alive through a dry summer without paying whatever price Holloway decides to set." The weight of it settled over the room like a physical thing. This wasn't just about Alex's land or Clara's freedom. It was about an entire valley of families about to lose everything to a man who'd never once ridden a fence line or branded a calf in his life. "We need those 11 families standing with us tomorrow," Alex said slowly, an idea forming behind his tired eyes. "Not just for my sake or Clara's, for theirs too. If Judge Perry sees the scope of what Holloway's actually doing, this stops being one widow's fraud hearing and starts being an entire valley's fight against a man trying to steal it out from under them." "It's the middle of the night, Alex," Samuel said. "Hearing's first thing in the morning. We don't have time to ride to 11 ranches and back before sunrise." "Then we don't sleep," Clara said, rising despite her exhaustion, despite her burned hands, some fierce new resolve burning through the last of her fear. "We ride now, all of us. Every hand on this ranch who can still sit a horse." Alex looked at her for a long moment, pride and love and something like awe all warring plainly across his face. "You heard the lady," he said, turning to his men. "Saddle up. We've got a valley to wake up." What followed was the longest night of Clara's life, though not in the way the fire had been. This was different, urgent, purposeful, every mile covered, feeling like a small victory stacked against Richard Holloway's carefully constructed lies. They split into groups, Alex and Clara riding together toward the Fletcher spread. First, the nearest of the 11 ranches Doc Riley had named. Thomas Fletcher, a weathered rancher in his 50s, answered his door in his nightshirt rifle in hand, clearly expecting trouble. "Whitmore, what in God's name is going on at this hour?" "Richard Holloway's been buying up your debts, Thomas," Alex said without preamble. "Been doing it to half the ranches on this ridge. He's trying to control the water source under my northern land. And once he does, every one of those debts comes due whether you can pay them or not." Fletcher's face went white. "That water source has been dry year insurance for this whole valley for 30 years. If one man controls it, he controls all of us." Alex finished. "There's a hearing this morning, Thomas. Fraud charges against my cook manufactured by Holloway's own man to force me into selling. I need you there. I need every rancher he's tried to squeeze standing in that courtroom when the truth comes out." Fletcher looked between Alex and Clara, taking in her soot-streaked face, her bandaged hands the exhaustion written plainly across both of them. "Give me 10 minutes to dress," he said finally. "I'll wake the Morrisons on my way." By the time the sun crested the eastern hills, word had spread across the valley like wildfire, faster even than the flames that had eaten through Alex's barn hours before. Rancher after rancher families, who'd spent months feeling the slow, tightening grip of debts they didn't understand, arrived at the county courthouse with the same grim determination burning in their eyes. Clara stood on the courthouse steps, exhausted beyond words, watching wagon after wagon roll in, and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 long years. She wasn't alone, not even close. Judge Perry's courtroom had never seen a crowd like the one that packed itself inside that morning, spilling out into the hallway and onto the front steps when the benches ran out of room. Richard Holloway arrived precisely on time, immaculate as ever, though something flickered across his composed expression when he saw the size of the crowd gathered against him ranchers. He'd quietly bled dry over the past year. All of them now very much awake to exactly what he'd been doing. "Mr. Whitmore," Holloway said smoothly, settling into his seat at the front of the courtroom. "I see you've gathered quite the audience for your cook's little hearing." "Not just her hearing, Holloway," Alex said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "You're about to find out exactly how many people you've been stealing from." Judge Perry called the court to order, his sharp eyes taking in the unusually large gathering with obvious curiosity. "This hearing concerns fraud charges filed against Clara Bennett. I understand there's been some development since the original complaint was filed." "There has, Your Honor," Alex said, rising. "With your permission, I'd like to call a witness whose testimony bears directly on the truth of these charges." "Objection," Holloway's lawyer said quickly. "This is highly irregular. So is filing a fraud complaint using a fictitious victim counselor," Judge Perry said dryly. "I'll allow it. Proceed, Mr. Whitmore." Samuel and Garrett brought Victor Hale in slowly, still bandaged, still moving with obvious pain, but alive and very much ready to speak. The color drained entirely from Holloway's face. "You," he breathed, half rising from his seat before catching himself. "You're supposed to be—" He stopped himself too late. The words hung in the air, damning and unmistakable, and Judge Perry's sharp eyes snapped immediately toward him. "Supposed to be what, Mr. Holloway?" the judge asked, his voice suddenly very cold. Holloway said nothing, but the panic flickering across his face said everything the courtroom needed to know. Victor Hale's testimony took nearly an hour, and by the end of it, there wasn't a single person in that packed courtroom who doubted the truth any longer. He told them everything. The real story of Millbrook, his own forgery, his own theft. The debt that had driven him to it, the guilt that had haunted him ever since Thomas Bennett's death. He told them about Holloway finding him 8 months prior, threatening exposure unless he cooperated. He told them about Elias Crane, the real but entirely innocent bookkeeper, coerced into signing a complaint against a woman he'd never met. He told them about the forged land claims on Alex's northern ridge, about the water source beneath it, about 11 other ranches whose debts Holloway had been quietly buying up for the better part of a year, waiting for the right moment to call them all due at once. And the attack on you 2 nights ago, Judge Perry said, his voice grim. Who was responsible? Holloway's men, Hale said, his voice steady despite the pain evident in every word. I told him I was done, that framing Mrs. Bennett was one crime too many even for me. He didn't take kindly to my conscience showing up 2 years too late. Murmurs rippled through the crowded courtroom, ranchers turning to look at each other with dawning fury as pieces clicked together in real-time debts they hadn't understood surveyors on their land. They'd been told were routine offers to buy that had felt strange, but that none of them had been able to fully explain until now. Your Honor, Alex said, rising again. I'd like the court to hear from some of the other men Holloway's been quietly targeting. Thomas Fletcher for one, James Morrison. There are at least 9 others in this courtroom right now who've discovered in the last several hours that their debts have been secretly purchased and consolidated under Holloway's control. One by one they stood. Fletcher spoke about the sudden pressure he'd felt to sell portions of his land at unfair prices. Morrison described threats disguised as friendly business advice. An older widow named Mrs. Sanderson, her voice shaking with fury rather than fear, described a visit from Holloway himself, suggesting she'd be wise to sell before her circumstances became more difficult than necessary. By the time the last rancher had finished speaking, Richard Holloway sat pale and silent at the front of the courtroom, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear the carefully constructed empire of debt and deception he'd built over the past year, collapsing in real time before an entire valley's worth of witnesses. Mr. Holloway, Judge Perry said, finally, his voice like ice, I am dismissing the fraud charges against Clara Bennett immediately given the clear evidence of a manufactured complaint. Furthermore, given the extensive testimony this court has just heard, I am ordering an immediate investigation into every land transaction and debt purchase you've conducted in this county over the past year. Until that investigation concludes, you are not to leave this county, and every transaction currently in dispute is hereby frozen. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Holloway's lawyer began. What's outrageous, counselor? Judge Perry cut in sharply. Is watching a man try to steal an entire valley's water supply through forged documents and fabricated criminal charges against an innocent widow. Sheriff Dawson, please take Mr. Holloway into custody, pending formal charges. The courtroom erupted. Clara, sitting beside Alex through the entire ordeal, felt tears finally break free as the weight of 2 years of fear and shame lifted from her shoulders all at once. Alex's arm came around her immediately steady and warm, and for the first time since she'd walked 10 miles up his drive, Clara Bennett let herself believe fully and completely that the nightmare was finally over. It wasn't quite over, not entirely, not until Sheriff Dawson had Holloway in irons, and Hale had been taken into protective custody to await his own reckoning for the crimes he'd committed both in Millbrook and since. But as Clara stood on the courthouse steps, afterward, surrounded by ranchers who'd spent the morning discovering they had far more allies in this valley than they'd ever realized, something settled in her chest that felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, like peace. Mrs. Bennett? Thomas Fletcher approached her, hat in hand, his weathered face solemn. I owe you an apology. Half this valley judged you before we knew a single true thing about your situation. That wasn't right. You weren't the one spreading rumors, Mr. Fletcher, Clara said gently. No, but I didn't stop them either, Fletcher said. None of us did. Man like Holloway, he thrives on folks staying quiet, staying divided, believing whatever's easiest instead of asking questions. Won't happen again, not on my watch. Other ranchers echoed similar sentiments throughout the morning, and Clara found herself for the first time since arriving in Silver Creek feeling less like an outsider and more like a woman who genuinely belonged. Mrs. Caldwell approached last, looking considerably more sheepish than she had in her general store weeks earlier. I owe you an apology too, Mrs. Bennett, she said, wringing her hands slightly. I shouldn't have gossiped the way I did, shouldn't have let that woman say the things she said in my store without speaking up against it. Thank you for saying that, Clara said, and found she genuinely meant it. "For what it's worth," Mrs. Caldwell added, "the whole valley's going to know by supper tonight exactly what really happened. Won't be a soul in Silver Creek who doesn't know the truth about you, Mrs. Bennett. That much I can promise." That evening, back at the ranch, the mood couldn't have been more different from the fear and chaos of the night before. The scorched half of the barn stood as a reminder of how close disaster had come. But the horses were safe. Clara was free, and Holloway's carefully built scheme lay in ruins alongside his reputation. The ranch hands gathered for supper, with an energy Clara had never quite seen from them before the relief of the day's events, loosening tongues and lifting spirits all around the long dining table. "To Mrs. Bennett," Samuel said, raising his cup as the meal wound down, "who walked into this ranch a stranger and walked out today having saved half this valley." "Hear, hear," Garrett called, and the whole table erupted into cheers and laughter that warmed Clara straight through, chasing away the last cold remnants of fear she'd carried since that first letter arrived. Danny leaned over toward her as the noise settled. "Told you my mother made bread like yours?" he said with a grin. "Guess that means you're stuck with us now." Clara laughed a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she hadn't allowed herself in longer than she could remember. "I suppose I am," she said. Later, once the dishes were cleared and the ranch hands had drifted off to their bunks, Alex found Clara once more on the porch, the northern ridge dark and quiet against the star-filled sky, no longer a symbol of danger, but simply once again the resting place of his family and the land he'd fought to protect. "Long day," he said, settling beside her. "Longest of my life," Clara agreed. "And somehow the best one, too." Alex reached for her bandaged hand, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles, despite the injury still healing there. "I meant what I said last night. Before the fire. Before any of this." "I know," Clara said softly. "I meant it too." "Then marry me." Alex said the words simple and unguarded, without a hint of hesitation, despite the suddenness of it. Clara's breath caught entirely. "Alex!" "I know it's fast," he said. "I know we've only known each other a matter of weeks. But Clara, I spent 5 years believing I'd buried my capacity to love someone right alongside Margaret. You walked up my drive and proved me wrong within the first 5 minutes of meeting you. I don't want to spend one more day pretending I don't know exactly what I want and exactly who I want it with." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, though these, like the ones on the courthouse steps, were nothing like the tears she'd cried in Millbrook. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Alex. 1,000 times yes." He kissed her, then slow and certain, sealing a promise neither of them intended to break, and for the first time in 5 long years, the Whitmore Ranch didn't feel like a house holding on to grief. It felt finally like a home built on something worth keeping. Word of the engagement spread through Silver Creek almost as fast as word of Holloway's arrest, and by the time the sun rose the next morning, half the valley seemed to know before Clara had even finished her first cup of coffee. "You're really doing this," Samuel said, grinning wide as he leaned against the porch railing. "Rich cowboy, marrying his cook. Never thought I'd see the day, boss." "Neither did I," Alex admitted, though the smile on his face said everything his words didn't need to. "Didn't figure on falling in love with the woman who kept insisting my coffee tasted like punishment." "It did taste like punishment," Clara said from the doorway, a dish towel still in her hands. "Somebody had to fix that before I agreed to marry you." Danny came sprinting up from the barn, breathless, as always waving a folded paper. "Boss Ryder just came from town. Says it's urgent from Judge Perry's office." Alex's smile faded slightly as he took the letter. Clara's hand finding his arm, instinctively old fear rising fast even after everything. He read it once, then again, his expression shifting from wariness to something harder to name. "What is it?" Clara asked. "Formal charges against Holloway," Alex said slowly. "Fraud, extortion, conspiracy. The county's building a case that could put him away for the rest of his life. Judge Perry wants us both to testify at the full trial in 2 weeks." Clara's stomach tightened. The relief of yesterday's hearing, Not quite enough to erase the dread of facing Holloway again, even from a witness stand with the truth firmly on her side. 2 weeks, she repeated. 2 weeks, Alex confirmed. And then it's over. Truly over, Clara. Not just dismissed charges and a hearing, a conviction. The kind that means he never threatens you or this valley again. Clara nodded slowly, steadying herself against the fear still clinging to her chest. Then we'll be ready, she said. The 2 weeks that followed passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. Equal parts joy and tension. The wedding plans Clara hadn't dared hope for, tangled up with the looming shadow of Holloway's trial. Word had spread of the 11 ranches he'd targeted, and the investigation Judge Perry ordered had uncovered even more than anyone initially realized. Bank records showed Holloway had been quietly funneling money through 3 different territories, buying up debts and forging land claims in at least 2 other counties before ever setting foot in Silver Creek. Victor Hale, cooperating fully now in exchange for a lighter sentence, provided document after document confirming the scope of the scheme. He's not just facing county charges anymore. Samuel reported one evening having ridden back from town with the latest news. Territorial prosecutors are involved now. Man's looking at years behind bars, maybe longer depending on what else they dig up. Good, Clara said with a fierceness that still surprised her. Sometimes the woman she'd become since walking up that drive so different from the frightened widow who'd knocked on Alex's door weeks earlier. Let him rot. But even as the legal noose tightened around Holloway, a different kind of trouble arrived at the Whitmore Ranch, one neither Alex nor Clara had anticipated. It came in the form of a letter, and then 3 days later, in the form of a man Clara had never met, stepping down from a dusty stagecoach with an expression that promised nothing good. Alex, the man said, extending a hand with far more coolness than warmth. It's been a long time. Alex's face went carefully blank in a way Clara had learned to recognize as controlled shock. Charles, what are you doing here? Word travels even to Denver. Charles said, his eyes sliding toward Clara with open assessment. Heard my sister's husband is remarrying already. Barely 5 years in the ground, and you're replacing her with the hired help. Clara felt the words land like a slap, though she kept her spine straight, refusing to let him see how deeply they cut. Charles is Margaret's brother, Alex explained tightly. Stepping slightly in front of Clara, the same protective instinct he'd shown against Holloway, now aimed at his own family. Charles, this is Clara, my fiancée. So it's true, Charles said, shaking his head slowly, something bitter twisting his expression. I always knew you'd move on eventually, Alex. Didn't expect it to happen quite this fast, or quite this convenient. Say what you mean, Charles? Alex said, his voice going flat and dangerous. I mean, Charles said, his eyes narrowing, that Margaret's family still holds interest in this land. Her father's original investment helped build half this ranch, in case you'd forgotten. And now I hear you're planning to marry some widow nobody in this valley knew a month ago, a woman who was nearly convicted of fraud, not 2 weeks past. Forgive me if I have concerns about what happens to my sister's legacy once you two are wed. Clara's chest tightened painfully. I was falsely accused, mister. I know exactly what happened. Charles cut her off sharply. The whole territory's talking about it. Doesn't change the fact that trouble seems to follow you, Mrs. Bennett. Fires, fraud charges, land disputes, all of it arriving in this valley the exact same month you did. That's enough, Alex said, his voice cutting through Charles's accusations like a blade. Clara didn't bring trouble to this valley. Holloway did, and if you'd bothered to actually learn the truth instead of riding in here to insult the woman I love, you'd know that. Charles's jaw tightened, old grief and new resentment warring plainly across his features. I loved my sister, Alex. Watching you replace her this fast, it feels like watching her get erased. Something in Alex's expression softened slightly, understanding finally cutting through his anger. Margaret isn't erased, Charles, he said quietly. She's buried on that ridge, and she'll stay in my heart until the day I join her there. But loving Clara doesn't erase what Margaret and I had. It doesn't dishonor her memory. It honors it, actually, because Margaret would have hated watching me live the rest of my life alone in a house that stopped being a home the day she died. Charles said nothing for a long moment, clearly unprepared for the quiet certainty in Alex's voice. She would have liked her, Alex added softly. Clara, I mean. Margaret never had patience for people who felt sorry for themselves. She'd have respected a woman who walked 10 miles rather than give up. Something shifted in Charles's expression. Not full acceptance, not yet, but the first crack in a wall, built more from grief than genuine anger. I still have questions, he said finally. About the estate, about what happens to Margaret's inheritance once you remarry. Then ask your questions, Alex said, but you'll ask them without insulting Clara again. Are we clear? Charles glanced once more at Clara, something almost like reluctant respect flickering behind his eyes at the way she'd stood her ground through the entire exchange without flinching. Clear, he said finally. Charles stayed 3 days, and though the tension between him and Alex never fully disappeared, something began to shift the longer he watched Clara move through the ranch, tending the garden she'd planted, laughing easily with Danny and Garrett over supper, sitting quietly with Alex on the porch each evening, in a way that spoke of genuine partnership rather than opportunism. On his final evening before returning to Denver, Charles found Clara alone in the kitchen, and for the first time since his arrival, his tone carried something other than suspicion. I owe you an apology, he said. Clara looked up from the bread she'd been kneading, surprised. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Charles, he corrected. And I do. I came here ready to hate you, ready to believe every ugly rumor about fraud and manipulation. Watching you these past few days, though. He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. Margaret used to say the measure of a person wasn't how they acted when things were easy. It was how they acted in a kitchen full of strangers at the end of a long day when nobody was watching to see if they were kind. Clara's throat tightened. That sounds like wisdom worth keeping. She was full of it. Charles said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through. Full of wisdom and full of stubbornness and full of more love than any person I ever knew. I think she'd have liked you, Mrs. Bennet. I think she'd have been glad Alex found someone who could bring this place back to life. Thank you, Clara said softly. Take care of him, Charles said, extending his hand properly. This time, warmth finally replacing the coolness of their first meeting. He's a better man than he lets himself believe most days. I intend to, Clara said, shaking his hand firmly. For as long as he'll have me. With Charles's blessing secured, however reluctantly given, the ranch settled back into wedding preparations, though the shadow of Holloway's trial still loomed over every quiet moment. The trial itself, when it finally arrived, proved almost anticlimactic after everything that had led up to it. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Hale's detailed testimony, financial records spanning 3 territories, 11 ranchers ready to describe exactly how Holloway had targeted their debts, and Elias Crane himself finally appearing to confirm he'd been coerced into signing a complaint against a woman he'd never met, Holloway's lawyers advised him to accept a plea rather than risk a jury. He took the deal. 12 years in territorial prison with the possibility of parole only after serving at least 8. Clara sat in the courtroom gallery beside Alex as the sentence was read, watching Richard Holloway's carefully cultivated composure finally crumble entirely as the reality of his future settled over him. Mrs. Bennet, he said, catching her eye as the bailiffs led him away, something almost pleading in his expression. I never meant for it to go this far. I was simply, save it, Clara said, her voice steady and cold, in a way that surprised even herself. You tried to destroy me the same way you destroyed 11 other families in this valley. I hope those 12 years give you plenty of time to think about exactly what you were willing to sacrifice for money you didn't need. Holloway had no response for that, and the doors closed behind him with a finality that felt at long last like the true end of the nightmare that had started with a letter signed only with 2 cruel initials. Victor Hale's fate proved more complicated, tangled up in old crimes and new cooperation, mercy and consequence, pulling against each other in ways that left Clara with more conflicted feelings than she expected. The prosecutors offering him a reduced sentence, Alex told her a week after Holloway's conviction, given how much his testimony helped build the case. 2 years instead of the 10 he might have faced otherwise. Clara sat with that for a long moment. Memories of Thomas. His laugh, his terrible business decisions, the way shame had eaten him alive over 8 slow months, rising up sharp and painful even now. "Do you think he deserves it?" she asked finally. 2 years for everything he took from us. "I think," Alex said carefully, "that the man who forged those documents in Millbrook 2 years ago and the man who confessed everything in that courtroom 2 weeks ago aren't quite the same person. Doesn't excuse what he did. But it matters. I think that when he finally had the chance to keep hurting you, or start telling the truth, he chose the truth, even knowing what it might cost him." Clara thought of Thomas again, of how desperately he'd wanted someone, anyone to simply believe he hadn't known, hadn't lied, hadn't betrayed the trust of everyone who'd trusted him. "I want to see him," she said suddenly. "Before he's sentenced. There are things I need to say." The meeting took place in a small room at the county jail. Hale, still bandaged, still moving carefully from injuries that hadn't fully healed his eyes, wary as Clara took the seat across from him. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly. "Neither was I," Clara admitted. "But I've spent 2 years carrying anger I never got to put anywhere. Thomas is gone. You're the only person left who can hear what I need to say." Hale nodded slowly, bracing himself. "You took everything from us," Clara said, her voice steady despite the emotion building behind it. "Our savings, our home, our name in that town. And you took Thomas in the end, even if you didn't mean to. He died believing everyone thought he was a thief. He died carrying shame that belonged to you." Hale's eyes glistened guilt written plainly across his battered face. "I know. I've known it every day since." "Good," Clara said. "I hope you carry that the rest of your life. But I also came here to tell you something else." She took a breath, steadying herself. "When you had the chance to keep lying to protect yourself the way you protected yourself in Millbrook, you told the truth instead. That doesn't erase what you did to Thomas. It doesn't erase what you tried to do to me. But it saved my life, Victor. And it saved 11 other families in this valley from losing everything the way Thomas and I did." "Why are you telling me this?" Hale asked, his voice rough. "Because I need to let go of the anger," Clara said simply. "Not for your sake, for mine. I don't want to carry Millbrook into my marriage, into whatever life Alex and I are about to build. I forgive you, Victor. Not because you deserve it, because I deserve to be free of it." She left the jail that afternoon, feeling lighter than she had in 2 years, the weight of Millbrook finally truly beginning to lift from her shoulders. With Holloway convicted and Hale's sentencing scheduled, the valley slowly began to heal in ways that went far beyond Clara and Alex's own story. The 11 ranchers, whose debts Holloway had manipulated, found their finances restored through the court's ruling, the fraudulent purchases voided entirely. Fletcher's spread, Morrison's outfit, Mrs. Sanderson's small parcel near the county line, all of it returned to rightful ownership, freed from the invisible strings Holloway had spent a year quietly tightening. "Funny thing," Fletcher said one afternoon, riding out to the Whitmore ranch with a wagon full of lumber. Morrison and 3 other ranchers close behind him. "Man tries to divide a valley to conquer it, ends up uniting it instead." "What's all this?" Alex asked, gesturing at the lumber. "Heard your barn took some damage," Morrison said with a grin. "Figured a valley that just got saved from losing everything owes the man who saved it a proper barn raising." Clara watched from the porch, tears pricking at her eyes, as wagon after wagon rolled in over the following days, neighbors who'd once whispered rumors about her now standing shoulder to shoulder with Alex's ranch hands, rebuilding what the fire had taken, turning disaster into something that looked remarkably like community. "I never had this in Millbrook," Clara admitted to Alex one evening watching the new barn take shape against the darkening sky. "Not even before everything fell apart. Never had neighbors who'd show up just because you needed help." "You've got it now," Alex said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. for the rest of your life if I have anything to say about it. The wedding itself, when it finally arrived on a warm afternoon in late July, was smaller than either of them expected, and larger than either of them had dared to hope for. Clara stood in the small room off the kitchen that had become hers over the past 2 months, staring at her reflection in a borrowed mirror, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. Gone was the faded green dress and worn shoes she'd arrived in. In their place, a simple ivory dress, Mrs. Caldwell had insisted on sewing herself a small apology stitched into every careful seam. "You look beautiful," Samuel's wife said from the doorway, having come to help with the final touches. "Never seen the boss smile the way he's been smiling all week. Man looks 10 years younger." "I feel 10 years younger," Clara admitted, smoothing the dress with hands that had finally fully healed from the fire's blisters, though faint scars remained as quiet reminders of everything she'd survived to reach this moment. Outside, the entire valley seemed to have turned out. Fletcher and Morrison and the other ranchers Holloway had targeted. Mrs. Caldwell no longer gossiping, but genuinely celebrating. Judge Perry, who'd insisted on attending once he heard the date. Even Charles had made the long journey back from Denver, standing near the front, with an expression that held nothing but genuine warmth. Danny waited by the makeshift altar Samuel and Garrett had built beneath the old oak tree near the house, grinning ear to ear, having appointed himself unofficial usher for the day. The whole ranch smelled of fresh bread and roasted meat. Clara's own recipes prepared by the kitchen staff she'd trained over the past 2 months. Warmth and abundance filling a house that had once felt like a graveyard. When Clara finally walked out toward the oak tree, her hand tucked into Samuel's arm, since she had no father left to walk her, she found Alex waiting exactly as she'd hoped. Not composed, not carefully controlled the way he'd been the day she first knocked on his door, but openly, unashamedly emotional. His eyes bright with tears, he made no effort to hide. "You look like you're about to cry, Mr. Whitmore," she murmured as she reached him, the old teasing rhythm between them settling comfortably into place even here. "Might be," Alex admitted, his voice rough. "Man's allowed to cry at his own wedding, isn't he?" "I suppose he is," Clara said, smiling through tears of her own. The ceremony itself was simple, brief, exactly the kind of thing that suited two people who'd already said the words that mattered most to each other on a porch weeks before any preacher made it official. When the moment finally came, when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the entire valley erupted into cheers loud enough to carry clear across the northern ridge. Loud enough, Clara liked to think, for Margaret to hear from wherever she rested, loud enough for Thomas to hear too, wherever his own peace had finally settled. Alex kissed her long and full and unguarded, and Clara felt for the first time in longer than memory, entirely and completely home. Months passed, the way months do, each one folding gently into the next, and Silver Creek slowly became known for something other than the coldest ranch in the valley. The kitchen stayed warm every single day, the way Clara had promised it would that very first afternoon. The dining table, once holding one lonely chair pulled out amid 11 pushed carefully in, now stayed full. Most evenings, ranch hands, neighbors, Danny's own mother, eventually joining them after Clara insisted on tracking down the boy's family and mending old wounds that had nothing to do with her, but everything to do with the kind of woman she'd become. Charles wrote regularly from Denver, his letters warmer with each passing month, an uncle in every sense, but blood to the family. Alex and Clara were slowly building. He visited twice more before the year was out, each time staying a little longer, each time leaving a little more reluctantly. Victor Hale served his sentence quietly, and Clara received one letter from him near the end of his first year, thanking her for the forgiveness she hadn't been obligated to give, promising to spend whatever years he had left, trying to be the kind of man Thomas had once believed him to be. She didn't respond, but she kept the letter tucked away as a small private reminder that even broken things could sometimes find their way toward something better. Holloway remained in territorial prison, his name spoken less and less as the months wore on, his once feared influence over the valley fading into little more than a cautionary tale parents told their children about greed and the price it eventually demanded. And on the ranch itself, life took on a rhythm neither Alex nor Clara had dared imagine possible in the dark, silent years before her arrival. One evening, nearly a year after Clara had first walked 10 miles up that long drive with nothing but a suitcase and a stubborn kind of grace, she found herself standing once more on the porch where it had all begun, watching the sunset gold and pink over land that had nearly been stolen twice once, by grief, once by greed, and had somehow against every odd survived both. Alex joined her there, as he had every evening since, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently against the top of her head. "Happy?" he asked quietly. "More than I ever thought possible," Clara admitted, leaning back into his warmth. "Do you remember what I said to you that first day? About why a man with a house this size lets it feel so empty?" "I remember," Alex said. "Best question anyone's ever asked me." "I think about it sometimes," Clara said. "How close I came to turning around and walking away when you opened that door and looked at me like I'd grown a second head." "I think about how close I came to letting you," Alex said quietly. "If I'd been a little more stubborn, a little more afraid, I might have missed the best thing that ever walked up my drive." Clara turned in his arms to face him, searching his face in the fading light, finding nothing there but the same warmth and certainty that had slowly, patiently thawed a heart she'd once believed was too frozen to ever love again. "When you arrived," Alex said softly, echoing words he'd spoken once before on this very porch, in a moment that felt like a lifetime ago and yesterday all at once. "I thought I was hiring someone to cook. And what do you think now?" Clara asked the same question she'd asked him then. Alex looked out at the ranch behind her, the barn rebuilt stronger than before, the kitchen glowing warm with lamplight, the sound of laughter drifting faintly from where the ranch hands had gathered for their evening meal. The whole valley settled and safe and free from the shadow that had nearly swallowed it whole. "I think," he said, his voice thick with emotion, he no longer bothered hiding, "that I was the one who was lost, and you were never supposed to change my life. You were just supposed to cook." "I was never supposed to change your life," Clara agreed softly, smiling through the tears gathering in her eyes. "But you did," Alex said. "I did," Clara whispered. She rose onto her toes and kissed him slow and certain, the way she had that first night on this porch when the danger circling them had felt insurmountable and impossibly far from over. Now there was nothing circling them at all. No threats, no forged papers, no cruel gossip waiting around every corner. Just the quiet, steady peace of two broken people who'd found against every reasonable expectation exactly how to become whole again together. She was not the perfect woman Alex had once imagined a wealthy man might deserve. She was better. She was real. She was strong. She had walked through fire twice, once metaphorical, and once devastatingly literal, and emerged on the other side, not diminished, but forged into something unshakable. She was the woman who reminded a grieving rancher that a wounded heart, however deeply buried, could still learn to love again. The rich cowboy hired a widow to cook, expecting nothing more than someone to fill his empty kitchen and disappear quietly into the background of his lonely life. He never expected that the woman who walked 10 miles to feed his ranch would be the very same woman who finally completely and permanently healed his frozen heart, and in doing so saved not just one man, but an entire valley that had forgotten what it meant to stand together. And from that day forward, the Whitmore Ranch was never cold again.